I know many of you will doubt the claim I am making about this game, that Capablanca carried out his kingside attack without calculating. But don't take it from me. None other than Garry Kasparov himself said that about this game of Jose Raul Capablanca, that he was able to carry this attack out without calculating by just putting his pieces on their ideal squares and slowly but surely attacking his opponent's king. His opponent, the great American Grandmaster Frank Marshall. This was a match they played in New York in 1909. I know you're going to enjoy this game. Capablanca has white, Marshall has black. Let us jump right in. E4 is played by Capablanca, E5, knight F3, knight C6, and bishop to B5. The Spanish opening, of course, played commonly today just as it was then. And D6 is played by Frank Marshall, the Steinitz defense. Today, usually people will play A6 and bishop A4 and then D6, sort of the Steinitz deferred is what it is called. That's more common nowadays. But D6 was played in this game. C3, standard idea, of course, taking away the ideal square for the knight, but also keeping the knight at C6 from jumping into D4 and preparing to play D4 himself. Bishop to G4, pins the knight on F3, and this move really doesn't have much of a purpose, really. For one thing, this bishop, this light-squared bishop, is more valuable than the knight on F3, and it doesn't really threaten anything at the moment. D3 is played by Capablanca. Notice he's not rushing, just putting his pieces and pawns on good squares. Bishop to E7, knight B to D2, the standard maneuver in the Spanish. The knight can go to F1 and hop into G3 or E3 later. Knight to F6, castles, castles, and rook to E1. And the setup Capablanca has here is very common to this very day. A very standard position to get both in a Spanish or an Italian game. And he could play this today and be perfectly fine. Here, knight to D7 was the strongest move, probably for black. The idea is to come into C5, put some pressure on D3, also threaten A6, so this bishop would need to give itself up for a knight, and black could get the bishop pair. But instead, Frank Marshall plays H6 to keep pieces out of the G5 square, but that's a little slow. Capablanca just plays knight to F1, continuing the standard maneuver. The knight goes to G3 or E3, and then knight to H7 by Frank Marshall, clearing the F-file so that he can play F7, F5, and perhaps attack on the king side. But knight to E3 is played first, hitting the bishop at G4 as well as putting some pressure on F5. That bishop moves to H5, and Capablanca plays G4, attacking the bishop at H4 and also clamping down on the F5 square. And so far, no calculation has been necessary to play these moves for white. He's just moving the pieces to natural squares and developing, just playing solid chess. The bishop goes to G6, and now anyone familiar with these structures know that this F5 square is a great place for a white knight. Capablanca just drops his knight into that very important F5 square. Now, in this position, Frank Marshall makes an error. He plays the move H5. The idea, I'm not exactly sure what his idea is, but the problem is he weakens himself on the king side. The better move would probably be knight to G5, looking to trade some pieces and reduce the pressure Capablanca has built up with his sound positional moves. But H5 was played first, then H3, HG4, and HG4, and really what has been accomplished favors Capablanca. The H-file has been opened. So the plan is becoming clear. He would love to move his heavy pieces to the H-file and attack down the H-file. Bishop to G5 was played. An example of tactical oversight, actually. Capablanca said that he thought knight to G5 was better. And Kasparov quoted him, but it was not mentioned that the obvious move for white here is just knight takes E7 check. And for queen takes E7, bishop G5, and white would win a piece. Had this happened in the game, I can guarantee you Capablanca would have played knight takes bishop check. He would have seen it immediately. But bishop to G5 was played in the game. Now knight takes G5. Again, no calculating. Grabbing the bishop pair and clearing the way for this F-pawn, maybe to come to F3 to strengthen E4 and G4. Knight takes G5 and king to G2. He's controlling the F3 and H3 squares, so this knight can't jump into those squares. But also, and more importantly, he's clearing the way for the rook to come to H1 so that he can shift his pieces to the open h-file. Still, no calculation necessary, just making the moves the board requires. d5. Good move from Frank Marshall. Basically, the old principle: if you're being attacked on the side of the board, you counterattack through the center of the board. He would love to take on e4 and exchange queens, and that would relieve almost all of the pressure. So Capablanca avoids that by playing queen to e2, avoids the exchange of queens, and adds some strength to the e4 pawn. Rook to e8, potentially giving his king some space to escape if the attack down the h-file were to work well. Rook to h1, very simple. There's an open file, you put your rook on it. Rook to e6 was played by Frank Marshall, and the thought was that this was setting up a trap for Capablanca, and the trap was this. Bishop takes knight, if Capablanca had taken on g5, queen g5, ed5, which looks good for white, obviously forking the knight and the rook, but then bishop takes knight. Obviously, the bishop can't be taken because of the pin. Pawn takes rook, and then bishop g4. And if in this position Capablanca had played ef7 check, then after king f7, the threat against the queen actually allows black to escape with a draw, because you have to play f3, and after bishop h3 check, king f2, queen to h4 check, king to e3, and you'd have a perpetual. And if black takes on f3, just king takes f3. So you'd avoid all that in that case. But Capablanca played the move queen to e3, and Kasparov believed strongly that Capablanca never calculated any of those variations that they just looked at. And Capablanca himself said, this is a great move, maybe the best move of the game, because it accomplishes so much. It puts pressure on the g5 knight and begins this shift to the queen over to the h-file to increase that pressure. So f6 is played to defend the knight at g5. And now, the old rule of thumb, your worst placed piece, this bishop at b5, the Spanish bishop, is not ideally placed. It belongs on this diagonal, aiming towards black's king. So, bishop to a4, preparing to put it on b3, knight to e7 to sort of shore up the d5 pawn and clear the c pawn so it can go to c6, trying to limit the scope of this bishop when it lands on b3, as it does on the next move. c6, trying to create some kind of wall on d5, but it's very hard to keep that up. Queen to g3. Capablanca simply shifts his pieces into attack mode. The queen can go to h4 or h2 to attack down the h-file. a5 gaining space on the queen side. a4 preserving his bishop on b3 and on that key diagonal. Knight to f7, trying to shift into a defensive position. Bishop to e3. Now, this is a strong idea. The threat is to play the bishop to c5. Not only does that hit the knight on e7 twice, if the knight moves away, the bishop controls f8, which means that black's king cannot escape from the attack. But still, simple threats without complex calculation. Really no calculation. b6 keeps the bishop out of c5, but it does create a weakness on b6 and c6. Rook to h4, simply preparing to double or triple his heavy pieces on the h-file. King to f8, trying to run his king away. Rook a to h1, doubling. And here, knight to g8. Frank Marshall tries to create some kind of strong point on h6 to keep white from breaking in against black's king. And here Capablanca plays the simple move, queen to f3, which he said forces black to capture the knight on f5. And the real threat from white is actually this interesting move, rook to h7, which is an exchange sacrifice. After bishop h7, rook h7, he's attacking g6 twice. And although I don't believe Capablanca bothered to calculate these moves, we will. Let's just see if black had played g6, what would have happened. ed5 comes first. If here cd5, then bishop to d5, and after pawn takes knight, bishop takes rook, winning material. And if instead the rook moves away from the attack, rook to f7 checkmate would happen instead. So what if he goes ahead and takes the knight? Well, then just pawn takes rook, and after knight d6, gf5, and we can see that white's attack is really unstoppable with these pawns right in the center of the board. So to avoid all of that, Frank Marshall simply takes the knight on f5. gf5, rook to d6, and now queen to h5. Capablanca triples on the h-file, and to think that he has gotten this position with the 2-bishop advantage and every piece in prime attacking position without any real calculation is really incredible. Rook to a7, he defends along that 7th rank, hoping to keep g7 protected. The queen goes to g6. Obviously, he'd love to attack the g7 pawn with something like rook to h7. Here, if black plays knight to e7, then simply rook to h8 check works. Knight takes h8, rook takes h8, knight to g8 to block, but then queen to h7. It's the knight twice, it's pinned. If king to f7 to allow the queen to protect the knight, then this shot, bishop to b6, attacking the rook and the queen, and if the queen takes, it's mate in two. Queen takes knight check, king to e7, queen takes g7 mate. And, you know, there's no need for Capablanca. I'm sure he intuitively knew that this would just simply work out for him. There's really no need to calculate it. Instead, Frank Marshall plays knight f to h6, trying to create some kind of block on the h file. But Capablanca just went ahead and sacrificed the exchange. Rook takes h6. If knight takes, then you just take, and you get this position, and black is completely lost. If rook to f8, then just rook to h8 check. Picks up the queen shortly after. So instead, Frank Marshall took with the pawn, then bishop h6, and if he retakes with the knight, you have the same position we just saw. So he flees away, tries to run away, with his king, but then queen to h7 check. If the king moves, he would lose the rook. But what happens is after king to e8, Capablanca doesn't take the rook yet, although he could, and he'd just be winning, but he goes ahead and takes on g8 first. Then when the king moves, queen to h7 check, queen to e7, and then this nice little tactic, bishop to f8, skewers the queen to the rook. After queen h7, rook h7, the king moves, rook takes a7, and white wins. And Capablanca said that this was one of his best games. Really an amazing game, an intuitive positional attack, a beautiful thing to watch. I hope you enjoyed this. See you again soon at Chess Talk. Goodbye.